Prisons weren't built to hold you. They were built to undo you. Brick by brick, breath by breath. Long before the modern prison system adopted the language of rehabilitation, cages had only one purpose: to isolate, degrade, and erase. They were designed not as places of justice, but as architectures of collapse, where the crime ended and the punishment truly began. In medieval and early modern Europe, there were no cells with beds, no clocks on the wall, no concept of rights. A prison was a hole in the ground, a tower with no light, a dungeon with chains so rusted they became part of the bones they held. Prisoners weren't classified by offense. Thieves, dissidents, debtors, and the falsely accused all rotted together. Not because they posed danger, but because they were inconvenient. The design was intentional: low ceilings to induce panic, walls that dripped with filth, air that carried the stink of feces, rot, and hopelessness, and silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating absence of being remembered. Food, when provided, was moldy bread and rat-soaked water. Sanitation didn't exist. You slept where you defecated. You ate near corpses. Illness spread faster than rumor. And if you survived long enough, your mind began to detach from time, space, and language. Because that was the point. Prison wasn't meant to contain a body. It was meant to unmake a person, to strip them of community, context, and identity until even they forgot who they had been. There were no guards in uniforms, no paperwork to track your sentence. You were held until someone paid, or confessed, or died. And in many cases, that last option was encouraged. Executions were clean. Prisons were the slow kill. Even the architecture whispered cruelty. Tiny windows placed too high to reach. Doors that creaked endlessly but never opened. Iron bars you could see through but never be seen through. You became a rumor with fingernails. And the irony? You didn't even need to be guilty. You just needed to be accused, or poor, or political, or disposable. Because in the world that built these prisons, the cage didn't prove you had done wrong. It proved someone else had the power to decide you didn't matter. In the medieval prison, there was no need to extract truth, only to extract obedience. Torture wasn't a secret. It wasn't hidden in basements or whispered in shame. It was practiced, documented, and even ritualized, a spectacle dressed as procedure. The dungeon was just the start. What happened inside was less about guilt and more about domination. You didn't need to be sentenced to face the rack. You only needed to be suspected. Once accused, your body became a confession waiting to happen. If your words didn't align with the authorities' expectations, they twisted your limbs until they did. And if you confessed too quickly, they assumed deceit and twisted harder. The tools were crude but effective. Thumbscrews, iron boots, the strappado, devices that tore muscle, cracked bone, separated flesh, each calibrated not to kill, but to destroy slowly. Pain was measured, inflicted in intervals. Too much, and you'd die, robbing them of control. Too little, and you'd resist, proving your guilt through defiance. And if your body failed to betray you, there were psychological methods. Sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, forced silence. You might be locked alone for weeks in total darkness, or lit day and night, so your mind fractured from overstimulation. Water was withheld. Names were erased. Time ceased to function. Eventually, you confessed to crimes you never committed, not because you were guilty, but because you were human, and pain makes liars of everyone. Torture chambers weren't dark mistakes in otherwise enlightened systems. They were tools of policy, sanctioned by courts, kings, and churches alike. And their goal wasn't justice. It was compliance. It was fear. A terrified prisoner is quiet. A broken one can't resist. And a dead one tells no stories. So the system kept grinding, one scream at a time. And when the blood dried, the iron was cleaned, the door shut, and the next name was called. Not everyone in prison had committed a crime. In fact, many had only committed the offense of speaking or simply existing in the wrong place, with the wrong beliefs, at the wrong time. The medieval and early modern prison wasn't about law. It was about power, and power needs silence. Throughout history, rulers, bishops, kings, and empires used prisons to remove opposition, not through debate, but through disappearance. The cell replaced the executioner. It was cleaner, less public, less likely to stir revolt. The body stayed intact, but the voice was erased. You didn't need a trial, you needed suspicion. Monarchs could imprison writers for heresy, a word so elastic it stretched to cover any discomfort. Priests were jailed for criticizing kings. Peasants were locked up for organizing grain protests. Foreigners, especially those with accents or new ideas, were treated as contagion, and so they vanished. One letter, one secret accusation, one whisper from the wrong mouth, and you were gone. No sentencing, no appeal, no proof. Just a knock at night, a hood over your head, and stone walls closing in. And the worst part? No one outside was told where you were. You became a non-person, living in a non-place. Political prisons weren't hidden. They were open secrets, symbols of control. Every town had one. Every regime used them. They were warnings carved in iron. Speak, and you will be silenced. Inside, these prisoners received the same treatment as criminals. Worse, sometimes. They were considered dangerous not because of violence, but because of ideas. And in a world built on hierarchy, a single thought could be more threatening than a sword. Writers were denied ink. Scholars were denied books. Rebels were denied names, and no one was supposed to return. But some did. And when they spoke, they told of years without sunlight, of guards trained to forget your face, of meals that tasted like mockery. Prison didn't punish the act. It punished the existence of resistance. And that's why it was so effective. Because nothing breaks the will like being buried alive while the world moves on. If prison was a cage, it was also a market. Behind the rotting walls and rusted bars, a system emerged. Not just to punish, but to profit. You weren't just a prisoner. You were currency, and your suffering had value. In many medieval and early modern prisons, inmates had to pay to exist. There were fees for food, fees for blankets, fees for a spot near the window. If you wanted cleaner water, you paid. If you wanted a shorter chain, you paid. If you couldn't pay, you went lower, dirtier, hungrier, sicker. The jailer wasn't just a guard, he was a merchant of misery. In some systems, prison positions were auctioned off, given to those who promised to extract the most income from their captives. It wasn't about justice, it was about returns. And the poorer the prisoners, the more they could be exploited. Families were extorted, bribes were expected. Everything was transactional. Even your cell placement, upstairs for the privileged, underground for the forgotten. But it didn't stop there. Many prisons developed forced labor schemes. Inmates were used to clean streets, build roads, produce goods, with no pay, no protection, no choice. They sewed uniforms. They mined salt. They carried stones for cathedrals that would never welcome them inside. Some were hired out to private businesses, leased like equipment. Others worked to repay arbitrary debts imposed by the prison itself. Charges for chains, candles, or punishment sessions. It was a loop of exploitation, punished into poverty, charged for survival, then forced to labor for the very hands that locked them up. And because poverty was often criminalized through vagrancy laws, begging bans, or unpaid debts, the poor cycled through the system endlessly. They were arrested, imprisoned, extorted, released, and re-arrested. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were profitable. In this world, prison wasn't a failure of justice. It was a functioning economy, fueled by despair. And every time a man screamed from the cold floor of his cell, someone outside heard coin. In many cities, the prison wasn't hidden. It stood at the center, stone, iron, and intimidation, not just as a building, but as a warning. You weren't supposed to forget it was there. You were supposed to stare at it, and fear becoming part of the story inside. Because in pre-modern societies, punishment wasn't just private pain, it was public theater. The prison served as a stage where shame was curated, and the imprisoned were actors cast without script or exit. In some towns, cells had barred windows facing the street, where prisoners were visible to all. Locals walked by and spat at them. Children were taught to point. Vendors passed food and watched it rot, just to remind inmates what they couldn't have. Public displays were routine. Prisoners in stocks, unable to move, bodies shackled to walls, faces swollen from beatings, exposed like caution signs. Their presence wasn't an accident. It was didactic. The message was clear. See what happens when you disobey. In some places, prisons held daily humiliations, parades of the condemned, forced labor in town squares, or mock trials reenacted for laughter. The line between justice and entertainment dissolved. People gathered not to question, but to enjoy. And the pain? It wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Townsfolk believed that suffering purified the soul, that degradation rebuilt order. So when a prisoner cried out, the crowd didn't flinch. They nodded. Some smiled. Some threw things. Because that's what guilt was supposed to look like. Messy, loud, defeated. Prisoners were sometimes forced to sing hymns, confess in public, or beg forgiveness from crowds who offered none. Others were dressed in costumes meant to mock their crimes, thieves in animal skins, adulterers with painted signs, heretics burned in stages built like altars. And when the performance ended, they were dragged back inside, not to recover, but to rot in the echo of their own humiliation. The prison wasn't just a tool of law. It was a moral theater, funded by fear, sustained by spectacle, and watched by a society eager to see itself on the outside of those bars. Because as long as the prisoner was visible, degraded, and sobbing, everyone else could feel safe, righteous, and entertained. The stone dungeons crumbled, the iron chains rusted, the public stocks were dismantled, and the gallows removed from town squares. But the logic? That never left. Prisons today come with paperwork, electricity, and air conditioning. They speak the language of rights, reform, and rehabilitation. But look closely, and the architecture of destruction is still there. More subtle, more clinical, but still designed to break. The isolation persists. The overcrowding persists. The silent assumption that pain equals justice, that suffering is deserved, still persists. And the people inside, still disproportionately poor, still disproportionately marginalized, still voiceless in systems built to process, not listen. They no longer rot in visible chains. They rot in time. 5 years, 10 years, life. Measured not in healing, but in delay, abandonment, and routine dehumanization. Solitary confinement remains a tool. Forced labor still exists, now under euphemisms like correctional work programs. Access to healthcare, education, or legal aid is rationed or denied. And mental illness, once interpreted as possession or disorder, is now simply managed, not treated. The modern prison has better walls, better locks, better branding, but it serves the same purpose: to remove, to silence, to make disappear. The legacy of medieval incarceration wasn't left behind. It was refined, legitimized by bureaucracy, sanitized by language, and exported around the world as a model of order. Today, the prisoner is a number, a statistic, a file, a cautionary tale, and society still prefers it that way. Because when you clean the floor, repaint the bars, and add fluorescent light, you can convince yourself it's no longer a cage. Just a building, just a system, just the way things are. But the truth is simple. Prisons were never about justice. They were about power, fear, and forgetting. And in many ways, they still are.